The crown landed on the wrong head. The crowd roared. The torches burned. And Charlotte didn't scream. She didn't even flinch. She just stood there in the rain, a child's hand in each of hers, watching the man she loved place a future on her sister's shoulders like it was the simplest thing in the world. Vivian smiled. William's face stayed stone. And then, in the middle of the cheering, in the middle of the fire and the noise and the celebration, William's eyes moved. Slowly, deliberately, to Charlotte, not to his new queen, not to the crowd, not to the 7-pack representatives watching from the platform. To her, to the three of them, standing in the rain like something he had already decided to lose. He held it for exactly 3 seconds. Then he looked away. Charlotte's hand tightened around her children's fingers. She turned and walked into the dark. One child on each side, 3 sets of footsteps disappearing into the wet grass, and nobody stopped her. Nobody called after her. Nobody even looked. But somewhere in that crowd, one person had gone very, very still. And they were smiling. The rain came to Everglades Ridge like it always did in southern Florida. Without apology, without warning, in great silver sheets that turned the marshland into something prehistoric and alive. It had been raining for 3 days by the time the ceremony of binding began. That should have been the first sign. Pack elders from 6 of the 7 territories had murmured about it in low voices, exchanging glances across the great stone courtyard of Blackthorn Keep. A binding ceremony held in rain was not unprecedented, but 3 consecutive days of it, beginning the morning the invitations went out, that was something older pack members felt in their bones. That was the land speaking. That was the swamp, in its ancient indifferent way, registering its protest. Nobody canceled the ceremony. Charlotte stood at the outer edge of the crowd, exactly where she always stood at gatherings like this. Far enough back to see everything, close enough that no one would think to look at her. She was wearing her blue cloak, the dark navy one with the silver clasp at the collar, because it was the only thing she owned that felt like armor. Eli stood on her left, his small brown cloak soaked through at the hem from the puddles he'd stepped in on the walk from the cottage. Rose stood on her right, unusually quiet, her blonde curls flattened by the rain, her eyes wide and moving across the crowd the way a child's eyes do when they sense that the adults around them are performing something they don't fully understand. Charlotte understood it perfectly. She had spent 18 months understanding exactly what this ceremony meant, what it would look like, what it would cost her. She had built her understanding in quiet, the way she built everything, carefully, without letting anyone see her work. She had read every account of a binding ceremony she could find in the Keep's archive room, on the 3 occasions she'd been allowed inside it. She had spoken to Elder Petra, the oldest woman in the 3rd Territory Pack, who had attended 11 such ceremonies and described each one in the precise, unsentimental language of someone who had seen how these things ended. She had known, she realized now, for at least 6 months. She had known and she had not left, and that was the part of this she would spend the rest of her life trying to understand about herself. The torches were lit along both sides of the stone platform. There were dozens of them, mounted on iron poles driven into the wet earth, burning hot and orange despite the rain. Some kind of pack accelerant soaked into the wood, she assumed, because nothing natural should burn that stubbornly in a downpour. The effect was dramatic and ancient and utterly intentional. The torches threw moving light across the crowd, across the assembled soldiers and warriors standing at attention along the perimeter, across the faces of 7 pack representatives standing in formal arrangement on the left side of the platform, and across William. He stood at the center of the stone stage in his ceremonial black and gold, a figure so composed and still that he looked like something carved rather than something living. His dark hair was damp. His jaw was set. He was holding the crown, a simple thing, really, for all the weight it carried, a circlet of beaten silver set with 3 green stones that matched the color of the Everglades at midday. And he was looking out at the assembled crowd with the expression Charlotte had come to think of as his armor face. Unreadable. Impenetrable. The face of a man who had decided, long ago, that the world would not be permitted to know what moved inside him. Charlotte knew what moved inside him. Or she had thought she did. The crowd parted as Vivian was escorted forward. And here was the thing about Vivian. The thing that made this particular cruelty so exquisitely complete. She was genuinely beautiful. not in any cheap or artificial way. She was golden-haired and long-limbed, and she carried herself with the unconscious grace of someone who had spent a lifetime being looked at and had simply made peace with it. She was wearing white and cream, layers of it, and even soaked from the rain she looked like something from a painting. She was smiling, the slight, controlled smile of someone trying to appear humble about something they'd wanted for a very long time. Charlotte watched her sister walk to the platform. She felt Eli's hand tighten in hers. He was 3 years old and didn't understand ceremonies, but he understood his mother's body, the way small children always do. The held breath, the stillness that is not calm but its precise opposite. He pressed himself against her leg and said nothing. William descended 2 steps from the platform as Vivian approached. Pack protocol. The Alpha King meets his chosen mate halfway. The symbolism was ancient. I come to you. I choose to come to you. The choice is mine, and I make it publicly, before every witness that matters. He placed the crown on Vivian's head. The crowd erupted. 7 packs, hundreds of wolves, a roar that bounced off the stone walls of Blackthorn Keep and rolled out across the swamp and disappeared into the rain. Charlotte heard it as though from underwater, muffled, distorted, arriving slightly after the image of it, like thunder after lightning. Welcome back to the channel, my dear friends. Before we jump further into the story, please take a moment to subscribe, give this video a like, and tell me in the comments which country you're watching from. Your support means the world to me and helps me bring you even more exciting stories. Believe me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Now, let's dive into the story. William's eyes found hers. She didn't know how, in that crowd, in that chaos, with hundreds of faces between them. But they did. They always had. That had been one of the first things she'd noticed about him at the midsummer gathering in Tampa 2 years ago. He could find her in any room. She had thought, foolishly, that it meant something. She held his gaze. She wanted him to see her clearly, not the composed, careful Charlotte who never asked for anything, but the real one, the one standing in the rain with his children holding her hands, watching him give her sister the life that should have been hers. She wanted him to carry that image. She wanted it to cost him something. Then she turned around. She didn't run. Running would have attracted attention, and Charlotte had planned this too carefully for an emotional exit to undo it. She walked steadily and deliberately through the outer edges of the crowd between the torch poles, past the line of pack soldiers who were watching the platform and not the shadows. She walked the half-mile back to the cottage on the southern edge of the estate, the children's boots splashing in the puddles of the gravel path, the sound of celebration still audible behind them, growing smaller with each step. Inside the cottage, she did not hesitate. The bags were already packed. They had been packed for 2 days, hidden under the bed in 2 duffel bags and a backpack. Clothing, documents, cash she had been withdrawing in small increments for 3 months, and the one thing she refused to leave behind. A small watercolor painting Eli had made of their family, 3 figures in shaky brushstrokes, 1 tall with orange hair, 2 small, all of them holding hands. No 4th figure. Even at 3, Eli had painted the truth of their life as it actually was. She changed the children into dry clothes. She bundled them back into their cloaks. She looked around the cottage one last time, at Rose's crayon drawings still pinned above the small writing desk, at the handmade quilt on Eli's bed, at the single white gardenia in a glass of water on the kitchen windowsill. The one she had found on the seat of her car 4 days ago, the last one William had ever left her. She left it where it was. Then she picked up the bags, took her children's hands, and walked out into the rain. She had memorized the route. Service Road south, through the back of the estate where the groundskeeping vehicles went, past the flood gate and out to the county road where she'd arranged for a car. Paid in cash, registered to a name that wasn't hers, through a contact she'd cultivated carefully over the past 3 months. The driver, a woman named Bet who ran a private shuttle service out of Homestead and asked no questions because Charlotte paid her enough to ask none, was waiting exactly where she'd said she'd be, engine running, headlights off. Charlotte loaded the bags, buckled the children into the back seat, sat in the front and pulled the door shut behind her. Airport, she said. Bet pulled onto the county road without a word. In the side mirror, Charlotte watched the torches of Blackthorn Keep grow small and orange in the dark, burning stubbornly in the rain. receding behind her the way things recede when you understand that you are never going to see them again. She did not cry. She would not cry for a long time yet. Not until they were on the plane. Not until she was somewhere over the Gulf of Mexico at 2 a.m. with her children asleep across her lap, and she looked down at Rose's face in the dim cabin light and thought, "She looks like him. She looks so much like him, and she always will. And there is nothing I can do about that, and I would not change it if I could, because they are the only good thing that came from loving someone who didn't choose me." That was when she cried. Quietly, without waking them, pressing her face against the cold oval window while the gulf spread out black and silver 40,000 feet below. By morning, Charlotte Edwin had vanished, and William Richard stood in the empty cottage, staring at Rose's crayon drawings still pinned to the wall. He stood there for a long time, long enough that his beta, a broad-shouldered man named Fletcher, appeared in the doorway behind him and said nothing, because Fletcher had known William for 15 years and understood that there were moments when words were an intrusion. Eventually, William reached out and unpinned one of the drawings from the wall. A small figure with orange hair holding the hands of 2 smaller figures. 3 people. No 4th figure. He folded it carefully and put it in his inside pocket. "Find her," he said. His voice was very quiet. That was always the more frightening register. William Loud was authority. William Quiet was something else entirely. Fletcher was already moving before the sentence was finished. And somewhere over the Gulf of Mexico, in the dark between Florida and whatever came next, Charlotte Edwin held her sleeping children and made herself a single promise. "He will not find us. And if he does, I will make him wish he hadn't." She had no idea, not yet, how much he needed her to be found. She had no idea what was waiting on the other side of this disappearance. She had no idea that the crown he had placed on her sister's head was not a love letter to Vivian. It was a chess move. And Charlotte, brilliant, careful, devastated Charlotte, had just walked off the board entirely, taking his most important pieces with her. The sky outside the oval window began to lighten at the edges. A new day was coming, and it would be the first day of a war neither of them had been planning to fight. Tell me, if you were Charlotte, standing in that rain, watching the man you love crown your sister, would you have stayed or would you have run? Drop your answer in the comments. Because the answer matters more than you think, and what happens next will make you question everything you think you know about William Richard. The first rule of disappearing, Charlotte had learned, was that you could not think like yourself. You had to think like the person looking for you. She had spent 3 months doing exactly that, sitting at the small kitchen table in the cottage after the children were asleep, a legal pad in front of her, mapping out every resource William Richard had access to and every method he would deploy the moment he realized she was gone. She had done it the way she did everything, methodically, without sentiment, crossing off options as she neutralized them. Burner phone purchased in cash from a Walmart in Fort Myers, check. Car registered to a Shell identity, check. Flight booked under a variation of her middle name using a secondary ID she had obtained through channels she would never discuss. Paid in cash at a travel agency in Coral Gables that still, miraculously, existed in the age of the internet, check. She was not running blind. She was running planned. But plans, she was about to discover, had a way of meeting reality and losing. Fletcher Gaines had been William's beta for 15 years, and in that time he had found 11 missing persons, recovered 3 stolen pack assets, tracked a rogue wolf from Jacksonville to the Tennessee border in under 48 hours, and once located a kidnapped pack elder by smell alone in a shipping container yard in Savannah. He was not, by any reasonable measure, the kind of obstacle you planned around and then forgot about. He stood in the parking lot of the Homestead Service Depot at 6:17 in the morning, coffee in hand, looking at tire tracks in the mud that the overnight rain had softened into something almost geological. Readable if you knew how to read it. He knew how to read it. "Private vehicle," he said to the young pack tracker standing beside him, a lean, sharp-eyed woman named Greta who had joined the Keep's security division 8 months ago and was still proving herself. Not pack registered. Single driver, 3 passengers. 2 of the passengers were small. He crouched, studying the depth variation in the tracks. She was carrying weight on the passenger side. Bags. She packed heavy. Greta wrote it down. Heading south. County Road South. Fletcher stood, looked in that direction. The road bent around a stand of cypress trees and disappeared. Which means she wasn't heading for the interstate. Not directly. She was heading somewhere she could transition, somewhere she could change vehicles, or catch something that doesn't leave a paper trail. Airport, Greta suggested. Too obvious. Fletcher finished his coffee. But yes, just not Miami. She'd know we'd have Miami flagged within an hour. He thought for a moment, turning over what he knew about Charlotte Edwin, which was more than most people at the Keep suspected. He had watched her quietly and without agenda for nearly 2 years. Not because William had asked him to, but because Fletcher was a beta, and a beta's job was to see what the alpha couldn't afford to see. What he had observed about Charlotte was this. She was the most quietly intelligent person in any room she entered. She never made a decision without first considering its consequences 3 steps forward, and she had been preparing for this night for far longer than anyone had realized. Fort Lauderdale, he said. Or Tampa. She'd drive north or she'd drive east, not south. And she'd do it overnight, when traffic is thin and cameras are. He paused. Greta, pull every toll camera between here and Fort Lauderdale. Midnight to 4 a.m. look for a nondescript sedan, single female driver, 2 child passengers. That could be dozens of vehicles. It could be, Fletcher agreed, already walking back toward his truck. Start with the ones that paid cash. He was in his truck and moving within 90 seconds. In the passenger seat, his phone buzzed. He glanced at it. William. He answered without taking his eyes off the road. I'm already on it, he said. A silence on the other end. Then, the children. I know. Fletcher. William's voice was the quiet kind. The kind that meant the conversation was over before it started, that the outcome had already been decided and they were simply working backward from it. Bring them home. I will, Fletcher said. And then, because he had known William Richard for 15 years, and because some things needed to be said even if they landed wrong. She's not a rogue. She's not a threat. Whatever you do when I find her, remember that. The line went quiet for a moment. Find her first, William said. Then we'll discuss what I remember. The call ended. Fletcher drove north in the gray Florida morning, the cypress trees blurring past his windows, the scent of rain still heavy in the air. In his chest, something complicated moved. The particular discomfort of a loyal man who suspects that the person he serves has made a mistake so large that loyalty alone cannot fix it. He pushed it down. He drove. Charlotte was in Pensacola by noon. She had not planned for Pensacola. Her plan had routed them through Fort Lauderdale, onto a regional flight to Atlanta, and from Atlanta on to a destination she had selected 3 months ago with the same careful logic she applied to everything. A mid-sized city in a state she had no known connections to, where she had arranged through a relocation service for a furnished apartment under an assumed name, where the wolf pack presence was minimal, where the alpha king of the southeastern territories had no jurisdiction and no allies. But Rose had gotten sick on the drive. Not dramatically, not dangerously. Just the particular misery of a 2-year-old with a fever, flushed and whimpering in the back seat, her small body radiating heat through her cloak. Charlotte had pulled off I-75 at the first rest stop, felt Rose's forehead, looked at her daughter's flushed face and glassy eyes, and made the only decision a mother could make. They needed to stop. They needed a room. They needed children's Tylenol and a cool cloth and a full night's sleep, none of which were available at 30,000 feet over the Gulf of Mexico. She found a motel on the outskirts of Pensacola that took cash and didn't require ID if you paid for 2 nights up front. She settled the children in the room, Eli solemn and wide-eyed, patting his sister's hand with the grave tenderness of a 3-year-old who had decided he was responsible for something. And she sat on the edge of the bed and recalibrated. Fort Lauderdale was off the table. The flight was missed. Her carefully constructed route had a hole in it now, and she needed to build around the hole without leaving a pattern that Fletcher could read. Because she knew about Fletcher. She had always known about Fletcher. He was the part of her plan she had been most afraid of. She opened her burner phone and spent 40 minutes rerouting. New flight, different carrier, departing from Pensacola Regional Airport in 2 days when, if, Rose was well enough to travel. New connecting city. New final destination. She had enough cash. She had enough of everything except time, which was the one resource Fletcher was also spending. She looked at her phone for a long moment after she finished. Then she turned it off and removed the battery. In the other bed, Eli had curled himself around his sleeping sister like a small, determined shield. Charlotte watched them both in the thin afternoon light coming through the motel curtains. Rose's breathing had steadied. The fever was coming down. She thought about William. Not about the ceremony. She had locked that away, filed it in the part of herself she was not going to open right now because she could not afford to be destroyed by it right now. She thought about William the father. William crouching in the tall grass beside the water at the edge of the estate, holding Eli's hands while the boy took his first real steps, both of them laughing. She had watched from the cottage doorway and thought, there it is. There is the man underneath the alpha. There is the one eye. She cut the thought off. She thought instead about what William would do when Fletcher found the Pensacola trail. Because he would find it, she knew that. The only question was how much lead time she had, and whether she could move fast enough when the moment came. The motel room was quiet except for the air conditioning unit rattling under the window and the distant sound of trucks on the interstate. Charlotte lay back on the bed without getting under the covers, her eyes on the water-stained ceiling, her body exhausted in a way that went beyond physical. She had one advantage, she told herself. One advantage that Fletcher, for all his skill, could not overcome. He was hunting a woman he had observed from the outside. She was running from the inside of her own life. She knew things about herself that no tracker could read in a tire print or a toll camera. She knew how she thought. She knew her patterns. And she was, right now, actively dismantling every single one of them. She allowed herself 6 hours of sleep. She set a mental alarm. She had always been able to do that. Wake within minutes of an intended time, one of the small, reliable tricks of her body she had learned to depend on. When she opened her eyes at 8 p.m., Rose's fever had broken, and someone was knocking on the door of the motel room. Charlotte was on her feet before the second knock. She pressed herself against the wall beside the door, her heart slamming. Eli was sitting up in the bed, looking at her with wide, still eyes. She pressed a finger to her lips. He nodded, solemn, silent, her serious little boy. She looked through the peephole. A motel housekeeper. Young woman, cart piled with towels, looking bored and vaguely inconvenienced, knocking on every door on the row. Charlotte let out a breath so hard it hurt. No thank you, she called through the door. We're fine. The cart moved on. She stood with her back against the wall for a moment, eyes closed, getting her heartbeat back under control. Then she looked at Eli. You okay, bud? He considered this with the gravity he applied to most questions. Are we hiding? He asked. She crossed the room and sat beside him on the bed and put her arm around his small shoulders. We're on an adventure, she said. He thought about this. Does Daddy know we're on an adventure? The word hit her like a fist in the sternum. She kept her face still. Not yet, she said carefully. But he will. It was, she realized, the truest thing she had said all day. William would know. William already knew. That was the shape of the problem, and no amount of careful planning changed it. She looked at her sleeping daughter. She looked at her solemn, watchful son. She made a decision. Pensacola was compromised. Not because Fletcher had found it, but because she had stopped here unplanned and unpredictable behavior left unpredictable traces. She needed to be gone by morning, fever or no fever, new route or no new route. She would drive north. She would cross the state line into Alabama before dawn, pick up a new vehicle in Mobile, ditch the current one somewhere it wouldn't be found for days, and catch a bus. Not a plane, not yet, to a city large enough to disappear in while she rebuilt the next stage of the route. It was slower than she'd wanted. It was messier, but it was survivable. She started moving at midnight. Fletcher found the motel at 6 the next morning. He stood in the parking lot and looked at the space where the car had been. Visible in the gravel, the particular compression pattern of a vehicle parked for several hours. And he looked at the room number the front desk had reluctantly given him after he showed credentials that made the night manager's eyes go a certain way, and he stood there in the early Mobile County morning light and felt two things simultaneously. The first was professional admiration. She had moved in the night, clean and fast, and she hadn't gone south the way instinct would suggest or north the way logic suggested first. She had gone northwest, toward Alabama, which was a faint, which meant she already understood that he would be looking at flight records out of Pensacola, and she had decided to make him look somewhere else while she found another route. The second thing he felt was concern. Not for the investigation. For Charlotte. Because a woman moving 2 toddlers in the middle of the night, rerouting a plan she'd built over 3 months, alone and afraid and still not making a single sloppy mistake. That was not a woman who had done something impulsive. That was a woman who had been pushed to the absolute limit of what a person could absorb and had chosen survival over everything else. He pulled out his phone and called William. She was here, he said. She's gone. She moved overnight northwest. She's heading toward Alabama. A silence. Can you? I can track her, Fletcher said. I will track her. But William. He paused, choosing the next words with the care they required. When I find her, and I will find her, she is going to need a reason to come back. Not a command. Not a summons. A reason. Another pause. Do you have one? The silence on the other end was longer this time. Yes, William said finally, and his voice, for the first time since Fletcher had ever known him, cracked slightly on the word. Just slightly. Just enough. Fletcher got back in his truck. He drove northwest into the white Alabama morning, toward a woman who didn't know yet that the man she was running from had been running a war of his own. A war she'd never been told about, because telling her would have put her in the center of it. She was already in the center of it. She just didn't know. That was the thing that was going to change everything. Charlotte had chosen Asheville, North Carolina, for 3 reasons. The first was size. Large enough to absorb a woman and 2 small children without curiosity. Small enough that she could learn its rhythms quickly and know when something felt wrong. The second was geography, nested in the Blue Ridge Mountains, far enough from the Florida swamplands that the southeastern pack network thinned considerably, the way a signal degrades with distance. The third reason was the one she hadn't admitted to herself until she was actually standing on the street outside the furnished apartment on Lexington Avenue, the children's hands in hers, the mountain air cold and sharp against her face after a lifetime of Florida humidity. It felt like somewhere a person could breathe. She had not breathed properly in 3 years. Maybe longer. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building that smelled like old wood and someone else's cooking, with 2 bedrooms and a window in the main room that looked out over the street and the hills beyond it, and in the mornings, when the light came in at a certain angle, it turned everything gold. Charlotte stood at that window on the first morning and held a cup of coffee and looked at the mountains and felt something move through her that she didn't immediately have a name for. It took her a moment to identify it. It was the sensation of not being watched. For 3 years at Blackthorn Keep, even in the cottage, even in the private geography of her own small domestic life, she had always been aware of eyes. Pack infrastructure meant pack surveillance. Every entrance, every road, every tree line had someone in it or something in it, some network of awareness that served William's security apparatus and that Charlotte had understood, practically, was there to protect her and the children, but that had also meant she had never, not once, felt truly alone. Here, in this 3rd-floor apartment on Lexington Avenue, she was just a woman with 2 children and a coffee cup, and nobody in the street below knew her name. She allowed herself exactly 1 minute to feel the relief of that. Then she got to work. She found a daycare for Eli and Rose within the first week. A small, warmly run place 4 blocks from the apartment called Sunrise Learning, where the woman at the front desk had kind eyes and asked no questions beyond the enrollment forms. Charlotte paid the first month in cash and explained that she was between bank accounts following a recent move, which was true enough to be convincing and vague enough to discourage follow-up. She found work in the second week. A small independent bookshop on Wall Street. The Asheville one, not the New York one, a narrow, crammed, wonderful place called Hollow Tree Books that smelled like paper and possibility, and that needed someone for 3 afternoon shifts and Saturday mornings. The owner, a compact and precise woman in her 60s named Harriet Oakes, had interviewed Charlotte for 9 minutes, watched her correctly shelve a card of returns from memory after being shown the system once, and offered her the position before Charlotte was fully out of her chair. "You've done this before," Harriet said. It wasn't a question. "I've always loved books," Charlotte said, which was also true enough. She did not say, I spent 2 years cataloging the archive room at a wolf pack estate in the Florida Everglades because it was the one place on the property where I could be alone and think. She did not say, "Reading was how I survived something I cannot name in this interview." She said, "I'm a fast learner," and Harriet said, "I can see that." And that was the beginning of the first friendship Charlotte made in Asheville, which was not a friendship yet but would become one, in the slow, careful way that Charlotte allowed things to become things. By the end of the first month, they had a routine. Mornings, Charlotte walked the children to sunrise learning, Eli carrying his small blue backpack with the serious air of someone embarking on important business, Rose holding her stuffed rabbit by one ear with the focused grip of a child who has decided that this rabbit is load-bearing. Charlotte kissed them both at the door and stood on the sidewalk for a moment after they disappeared inside, feeling the particular acute love that is indistinguishable from terror. Afternoons, the bookshop. The smell of it. The particular quiet of a place where people came to be transported. Charlotte moved through the stacks with the efficiency of someone who understood systems, and she talked to customers with the warmth of someone who had learned, over years of being the background person in a room full of more dramatic personalities, how to make other people feel seen. Evenings, the apartment. Dinner, which Eli approached as a negotiation and Rose approached as an opportunity for artistic expression with her food. Baths, stories, the particular battle of getting two small people horizontal and unconscious that Charlotte had learned to treat as a logistical challenge rather than a confrontation. Then the quiet of the apartment after they slept, which was simultaneously the best and worst part of every day. Best because she could think. Worst because she could think. She thought about the route she'd taken. The midnight drive from Pensacola, the bus from Mobile to Birmingham, the train from Birmingham to Atlanta, the car she'd rented in Atlanta under a name she'd spent 6 months carefully constructing a paper identity for. The drive up through the Georgia mountains into North Carolina as dawn broke over the Blue Ridge, and Rose, fever finally gone, had pressed her face against the car window and said, "Pretty," in the wondering way of a child encountering something for the first time. She thought about whether Fletcher had followed the Alabama Trail or the Atlanta one. She thought about what William was doing. She tried not to think about what William was doing. It was Harriet who noticed first. 6 weeks into the job, on a slow Tuesday afternoon when the shop was empty and Charlotte was reorganizing the local history section with the focus of someone who needed to organize something she could actually control, Harriet appeared at the end of the aisle with 2 cups of tea and the expression of a woman who had decided a conversation was happening whether invited or not. "Sit," Harriet said, gesturing to the low bench between the shelves. Charlotte sat, because Harriet had a way of making suggestions that precluded argument. "You're watching the door," Harriet said, handing her the tea. Charlotte wrapped both hands around the cup. "It's a bookshop. People come in through the door. You watch it differently from how people watch a bookshop door." Harriet settled beside her with the practiced ease of a woman in her 60s who had made peace with her body. "You watch it like you're doing a calculation every time someone walks in. Yes or no? Threat or not?" Charlotte said nothing. "I'm not asking you to explain yourself," Harriet said. "I'm not asking anything at all. I'm telling you what I see, because I'm old enough to recognize it, and because I think you came here to stop having to carry things alone, even if you haven't admitted that to yourself yet." She sipped her tea. "Whatever you're running from, it doesn't change what I see in you, which is someone who is, frankly, remarkable, and someone who deserves to know that another person sees it." Charlotte looked at her tea for a long moment. "Thank you," she said, and her voice came out rougher than she'd intended, which meant the feelings she'd packed into the back of her throat were closer to the surface than she'd managed. Harriet patted her knee once, briskly, with the pragmatic warmth of someone who understood that too much tenderness can undo a person. Then she stood up and went back to the counter, and they did not speak of it again. But something shifted. Slightly, imperceptibly, like a door that has been pressed against for a long time finally moving half an inch. Charlotte began very slowly to exhale. She almost missed the man watching the bookshop on a Wednesday evening in her 7th week. Almost. She was locking the front door after closing, the street quiet in the early evening dark, the mountains a blue-black silhouette against a sky the color of old pewter. She had the key in the lock, and she was thinking about whether Eli had finished his dinner, or just redistributed it across the table. And she almost didn't look across the street. But she did, because 3 years of living inside a pack's security consciousness had given her a peripheral awareness she couldn't turn off even when she wanted to. A man, standing at the edge of the opposite sidewalk, partially behind the overhang of the coffee shop that was already closed, hands in his jacket pockets, looking at hollow tree books with the stillness of someone who has been standing in exactly that spot for longer than a casual passerby would stand anywhere. Charlotte did not react. She finished locking the door. She put the key in her bag. She adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder. She looked again. The man was still there. He wasn't Fletcher. She would have recognized Fletcher. This was someone else. Younger, leaner, with the particular quality of controlled stillness that she associated with trained pack members, but that could also belong to other things entirely, and she was not going to make an assumption when an assumption could cost her everything. She turned right and walked toward the daycare, which was the direction she always walked. She did not hurry. She turned the first corner, and then she did hurry for 1 block until she reached the crossing where she normally turned left. Instead, she turned right, then right again, doubling back through the block via the alley, coming out on Wall Street 30 meters east of the bookshop. The man was gone, or he had moved. She stood on the corner for 3 seconds, long enough to look, short enough not to be memorable, and then walked to the daycare, collected her children, came home, and locked every lock on the apartment door. She sat at the kitchen table after the children were in bed and thought about the man across the street with the controlled stillness, and she thought about how she absolutely knew, that she had not imagined it, and she thought about what it meant if Fletcher had found Asheville, and what it meant if it wasn't Fletcher at all, because there was a possibility she had not fully allowed herself to consider until this moment. The Southeastern Territories were not the only wolves in the country. William was powerful, but power had enemies. And Charlotte Edwin, mother of the Alpha King's only children, was not just a woman who had run away. She was, from certain angles, a very valuable piece. If someone other than William had found her, someone who wanted leverage over the most powerful alpha in 7 states, then running from William had just become the least of her problems. She opened her burner phone. She stared at it for a long time. Then she did the thing she had promised herself she would never do. She typed William's number. She didn't call it. She wasn't there yet. She might never be there. But she typed it into a new message thread, and she sat with her thumbs hovering over the keyboard, and she thought about what she would say if she could say anything. Your children are safe. I need you to know that. Whatever you think of me, whatever you're doing right now to find us, they are safe, and I am keeping them safe, and I need you to know. She stopped. She deleted the draft. She turned the phone off. She looked at the mountain outside her window, dark and enormous and absolute, and she thought, something is coming. Something that is not Fletcher and not William, and not anything I planned for. And for the first time since the night of the ceremony, Charlotte Edwin felt something she was entirely unprepared to feel. She felt afraid. She found out what it was 3 days later. His name was Conrad Voss. He was the alpha of the Northern Appalachian Pack, a territory that ran from western North Carolina straight up through Virginia and into West Virginia, a cold, aggressive, territorially ambitious pack that had been in a grinding political conflict with William's southeastern territories for 11 years over boundary rights and resource access. Charlotte knew about Conrad Voss the way she knew about most things peripheral to William's world. Quietly from the archive room, from overheard conversations, from the careful collateral education of a woman who had understood that information was the only power available to her. She knew he was dangerous. She knew he was smart. She knew he had been looking for years for a pressure point on William Richard. She knew now, sitting in a coffee shop across town from the bookshop where she'd spotted his tracker, that she had made a catastrophic error. She had run from William's protection. She had run straight into Conrad Voss's territory. And Conrad Voss had found her in 7 weeks, which meant he had resources she hadn't accounted for and sources she hadn't identified. And the man she had seen across the street was not the only one watching her. He was just the one who had wanted her to see him. The message had been deliberate. He knew she was smart enough to read it. I know where you are. I know who you are. Let's see what you do next. Charlotte set her coffee cup down very carefully on the table. She thought about Eli and Rose at Sunrise Learning, for blocks away, in a city that was now, she understood with crystalline clarity, not safe. She thought about William. She thought about the phone in her bag with his number typed into an unsent message. She thought about what it meant to ask for help from the man who had broken her. She thought about what it cost. She thought about Eli asking, in a motel room in Pensacola, "Are we hiding?" She thought about Rose's face against the car window saying pretty at the mountains as they drove into them. She thought about what she was willing to do for her children. The answer to that question had always been the same. It had been the same from the moment she'd first held them. It was a number with no ceiling. She picked up the burner phone. She opened the unsent message. Her thumbs moved. "William, I need your help. Before you say anything, I need you to listen. Something has found us. Not Fletcher. Something worse. I don't have time to explain everything. I need to know if you can get someone here in 12 hours without Conrad Voss knowing they're coming. If you can do that, if you can do just that one thing, I will tell you where we are." She stared at the message. She pressed send. Then she put the phone face down on the table, picked up her coffee, and waited. It took 43 seconds. The reply came in 3 words. "Tell me where." Think about this for a moment. Charlotte built something real in Asheville. A life, a routine, a beginning. And she had to burn it to the ground to keep her children safe. What would you have done differently? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because Chapter 4 is where everything collides and nothing turns out the way either of them expected. He came himself. Charlotte had not expected that. She had expected Fletcher, or a team of pack security, or some carefully arranged extraction protocol delivered through intermediaries. The kind of response that maintained distance while solving the problem, which was how William Richard had always operated when the situation involved her specifically. Maintained distance. Solved the problem. Left the gardenia on the car seat and called it communication. She had not expected him to come himself, alone, in a black truck with Florida plates that he parked 2 streets away from the apartment building on Lexington Avenue at 3:17 in the morning, 41 hours after she had sent the message. She knew it was him before she saw him. She was standing at the window. She had not slept. She had not expected to sleep. She had spent the past 41 hours in the particular hypervigilance of someone who has sent a distress signal and doesn't know what shape the response will take. And she saw the truck pull in 2 streets over, and she knew. The way he moved when he got out. The particular set of his shoulders. The way he stood for a moment on the empty street and looked up at the building the way you look at something you've been trying to find for a long time. She stepped back from the window. Her heart was doing the embarrassing, uncontrollable thing it had been doing since Tampa 2 years ago. And she hated it. She genuinely hated her own heart for its consistency on the subject of William Richard. She waited. The knock, when it came, was quiet. 3 knocks, deliberate spacing. Not Fletcher's knock. She knew Fletcher's knock, had opened the cottage door to it dozens of times. This was different. This was a man who was uncertain, for perhaps the first time in his life, about his reception. Good, she thought, and then felt guilty for thinking it, and then stopped feeling guilty, because she had earned the right to make him uncertain. She opened the door. He looked terrible. That was the first thing she registered, and she registered it against her will, because she had constructed a very specific internal image of William over the past 7 weeks. Cool, composed, the unreadable alpha going through the administrative motions of locating a missing asset, and the man standing in her doorway did not match that image in any particular. He had not slept. The evidence was in the specific grayness around his eyes, the kind that comes not from one bad night, but from many. He was wearing a dark jacket over a plain shirt, no ceremonial anything, no indication of rank. Just a man in his late 30s who had driven or flown or done whatever combination of things it took to cover the distance from Everglades Ridge to Asheville in 41 hours, and who was now standing in her doorway looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize because she had never seen it on his face before. It took her a moment. It was anguish. Not performed anguish. Not the strategic display of remorse that powerful men sometimes deploy when they need something. The real kind. The kind that has been living behind a person's eyes for weeks and has nowhere left to hide. "Charlotte," he said. Just her name. The way he said it, quietly, carefully, like something he'd been holding in his mouth for a long time and was finally allowed to put down. "Come in," she said, because the children were asleep and this conversation was not going to happen in the doorway. "And keep your voice down." He came in. She closed the door behind him. He stood in the middle of her small living room and looked around it. At the children's shoes by the door, one of Eli's paired neatly and one tipped on its side the way he always left it. At Rose's drawing pinned to the refrigerator visible through the kitchen doorway. At the bookshelf Charlotte had assembled from a second-hand shop in her second week. At the mountain visible through the window in the blue dark of the early morning. And he took it all in with the expression of a man, cataloging evidence of a life he had not been present for. "Sit down," Charlotte said. She did not sit. She stood with her arms crossed, her back against the wall beside the kitchen doorway, in the position that put her equidistant between the front door and the hallway to the children's room. He noticed. Of course he noticed. "You're still calculating exits," he said. "Old habit," she said. "Sit down, William." He sat. The couch was small and slightly too low for his frame, and he looked mildly absurd on it. The alpha king of 7 territories folded onto a second-hand sofa in a North Carolina apartment, and Charlotte would have found this funny in some other version of this conversation. In this version, she did not. "Conrad Voss," she said. "I know. He has at least 2 people watching me. Possibly more. One of them wanted me to see him. It was a message. He knows I'm smart enough to receive it. I know that too." "Then tell me something I don't know," Charlotte said. "Tell me why Conrad Voss knows about me and the children at all. Tell me how a pack alpha in North Carolina knew exactly where to find us 7 weeks after we left Florida, when I took every precaution I knew how to take." She paused. "Tell me if there's a leak inside your operation. And tell me if that leak is why you came alone." William looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "To all of it." The room was very quiet. Outside, Asheville was sleeping, the mountains dark and enormous in the window. "Talk," Charlotte said. He talked. He had not talked, really talked, without the armor, without the management. In so long that it came out rough at first, like a door that has been sealed too long and requires effort to open. But it came. It began 11 years ago. The boundary conflict with the Northern Appalachian Pack was not, he told her, a simple territorial dispute over resources and rights. It was a deliberate, long-running campaign by Conrad Voss to destabilize the southeastern territories from within, to identify and exploit every pressure point in William's leadership until the alliance of 7 packs fractured and Voss could move into the resulting vacuum. It was a patient, intelligent, vicious strategy, and it had been working in small increments for over a decade. 3 years ago, it escalated. Conrad Voss had obtained intelligence from a source inside the Southeastern Pack network that William had spent 2 years trying to identify. That William's chosen mate was not Vivian Edwin. It was Charlotte. The connection between them, the 4 years of unnamed almost relationship. The children. Voss had known about the children almost as early as the Pack elders had. And he had understood immediately what Charlotte and the children represented. The Alpha King's vulnerability. His exposed flank. The one thing that could be used to break him. The threat came in the form of a message delivered to William's desk 18 months before the ceremony of binding. Charlotte was quiet while he described it. She was very still, the way she went still when she was processing something large, assembling the pieces in the order they needed to be assembled. The message had been simple. If William publicly claimed Charlotte as his mate, if he brought her into the formal center of his world, gave her the title, made her the Alpha Queen, then Conrad Voss would move against her. Not against William. Against her and the children. It was not an idle threat. It was delivered with enough specificity about Charlotte's movements, the children's routines, the cottage, the archive room, the specific days and times and details of her life inside the estate, to make clear that Voss already had infrastructure inside Blackthorn Keep. He could reach her. Whenever he chose. And he would choose to reach her the moment she became important enough to be worth reaching for. William had spent 6 months trying to find the leak. He hadn't found it. He had spent 3 months after that trying to find another solution. Any solution that let him protect Charlotte and the children without sacrificing them to the threat. He had consulted Fletcher. He had consulted Pack lawyers. He had consulted two former Alpha Kings whose territories had navigated Voss's long game before, both of whom had told him, in their different ways, that there was no clean answer. There was only the choice between two painful things. "So you chose Vivian," Charlotte said. Her voice was very flat. "I chose to make you appear unimportant," William said. "To Voss. To the entire pack network. By publicly selecting Vivian, I removed you from the target position. You became the Alpha King's former, whatever we were. The woman who wasn't chosen. The invisible one." He paused. "I was counting on you staying. Staying in the cottage, staying peripheral, staying safe," Charlotte said. The word came out with an edge on it. "You were counting on me staying in the cottage on the edge of your estate and being small and invisible while you went inside and married my sister. I was counting on keeping you alive," William said. And his voice broke on the last word, just slightly, just enough. "Charlotte, I was trying to keep you alive. I was trying to keep the children alive. I made the calculation that Voss wanted leverage, not bodies, and that if I made you invisible he'd lose interest and look for another." "You made the calculation without telling me," Charlotte said. "You made a decision about my life and my children's lives, and you did not tell me. You let me stand in that rain and watch you put a crown on my sister's head, and you did not tell me. I couldn't tell you. If you'd known." "I would have run," Charlotte said. "Immediately. Exactly the way I ran anyway, except I would have known why, and I would have been running towards something instead of away from." She stopped. Pressed her hand briefly over her mouth. Got it back under control. "I would have had a choice, William. You took my choice away." He said nothing, because there was nothing to say to that. "It was true. And now Voss has found me anyway," she said. 7 weeks after I left. Which means your plan, the ceremonial misdirection, the public rejection, all of it didn't work. It bought 7 weeks. And it cost," she stopped again. "It cost everything," she didn't say. She didn't need to say it. William leaned forward on the too small couch and put his face in his hands. It was the most unguarded she had ever seen him. More unguarded than the parking lot in Bonita Springs. More than the nights in the cottage when he'd thought she was asleep and he'd sat in the chair beside Eli's bed with a particular stillness that she had always read as love, because what else could it be? "I know," he said into his hands. "I know what it cost. I've known every day since you left." "Charlotte," he looked up. "I am telling you now. I am telling you everything now. Because you asked me to listen, and I'm listening, and I need you to hear this one thing." She waited. "I did not choose Vivian," he said. "I chose you. I have been choosing you since Tampa. I chose you when I put a crown on another woman's head to try to make you invisible to a man who wanted to use you against me. It was the wrong choice. It was possibly the worst choice I've ever made, and I have made choices I will spend the rest of my life accounting for. But it was not a choice against you. It was never against you." Charlotte looked at him across the small living room, in the blue dark of the Asheville morning, with the mountains in the window and her children sleeping down the hall, and she felt the full weight of the past 7 weeks. The planning, the running, the midnight drive, Rose's fever in the motel, the man across the street with his deliberate stillness, the unsent message, and the sent one, and the 43 seconds before the reply. She felt all of it pressing against the inside of her chest. And beneath it she felt something else. She felt the thing she had been trying to outrun since the ceremony. Not anger. Not devastation. The fact that she still loved him. She hated that. She genuinely, thoroughly hated it. "That doesn't fix anything," she said. "I know. It doesn't undo any of it. I know that too. Your plan failed. Conrad Voss is outside this building, or his people are. And I have 2 children down that hall, and you came here alone, which means either you genuinely couldn't trust your own team enough to bring them, or you wanted to see me without witnesses. And I don't know which of those things concerns me more." "Both," William said. "Both things are true." He reached into his jacket and set something on the coffee table between them. She looked at it. It was a folded piece of paper. Small, slightly worn at the creases, the paper soft from having been folded and unfolded many times. She recognized it before she opened it. It was Rose's crayon drawing, the one she'd left pinned to the wall. 3 figures in shaky brushstrokes, one tall with orange hair, 2 small, all holding hands. He had been carrying it since the morning he'd found the empty cottage. Charlotte looked at the drawing for a long moment. Conrad Voss made a move 2 days ago, William said quietly. That's partly why I came myself, and why I came fast. He filed a legal challenge through the Interpact Tribunal, a claim of parental rights obstruction against you on my behalf, which he doesn't have standing to do, but the filing is public, which means he's not hiding anymore. He's not being subtle. He's done waiting. Charlotte's eyes moved from the drawing to William's face. What does that mean practically? It means he's shifting from surveillance to action. It means he's going to move against you directly and soon, and I have approximately, William checked his watch, 36 hours before he can get tribunal authorization that gives him legal pretext to approach you with PAC authority behind him. So we have 36 hours. We have 36 hours. Charlotte looked at the mountain in the window. The sky was beginning to lighten at the very edges, the first gray suggestion of morning finding its way over the ridge. Fletcher, she said. Where is he? 2 hours out. I have a team staged in Hendersonville. Close enough to move, far enough not to spook Voss's watchers into early action. You planned this. I planned for the possibility that you'd let me in the door, William said. I didn't take it for granted. She almost said something to that. She almost said several things. She held all of them back. There's something else, William said. She looked at him. The leak, he said. The source inside my network that's been feeding Voss information for 2 years. The reason he found you in 7 weeks. He paused. I found it. 2 weeks ago. I know who it is. Charlotte was very still. It's someone who had access to everything, William said. Someone who knew about you and the children, your movements, the archive room, the cottage. Someone who was in a position to observe all of it over a long period of time, and who had a motive I didn't see until it was almost too late. Charlotte thought about who had access to everything, who had been present for all of it, who had watched Charlotte and William with the particular attention of someone who was paying attention for reasons that weren't immediately visible. The answer arrived in her mind with the cold precision of something she should have seen sooner. Vivian, she said. William said nothing, which was answer enough. Charlotte sat with that for a moment. Her sister, her luminous, golden-haired sister who had stood at the altar in cream and white and received a crown that was never meant for her, who had smiled her controlled smile, who had Charlotte now understood. Not been a passive recipient of William's political maneuver, but an active participant in Conrad Voss's long game. For how long? How long had Vivian been feeding information to a rival pack alpha about her own sister, about her own sister's children? How long? Charlotte asked. Her voice was very quiet. At least 18 months, William said. Possibly from the beginning. The beginning. From Tampa. From the first night. Charlotte thought about all the times Vivian had called her in those 18 months. The casual questions about the keep, about the children, about William. The sisterly interest that Charlotte had taken at face value because she was the kind of person who took things at face value when she loved the person offering them. She pressed her hand over her mouth again. This time the feeling behind it was not grief. It was something colder. Something that would need to be dealt with properly and completely, and not tonight. Okay, she said. She took her hand away. She straightened. William was watching her with an expression she could now read, now that the armor was off. Something between awe and sorrow, and the particular tenderness of a man watching someone he loves absorb a blow that he is responsible for, however indirectly. Okay, she said again. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to call Fletcher and move the team in from Hendersonville. Not here. I'll give you a staging point. There's a parking structure 2 blocks north that Voss's watchers aren't covering on the west side. I mapped the gaps in their surveillance pattern 2 days ago. She moved toward the kitchen, already thinking. We have 36 hours. Voss is going to move before the tribunal authorization if he thinks we're onto him, which means we have less than that. We need to be out of Asheville before daylight, and we need to move the children without them being seen, which means... Charlotte. She stopped. I know, she said, without turning around. I know we still have things to say to each other. I know this isn't resolved. I know that what you did, what you chose not to tell me, I know that's not something that gets addressed in one conversation at 3 a.m. She turned around. But right now I have 2 children down that hall and a hostile pack alpha outside this building in 36 hours. So everything else waits. William looked at her. The anguish was still there behind his eyes. But something else was there too, now, something steadier. Tell me what you need, he said. Charlotte told him. And William Richard, Alpha King of 7 territories, took out his phone and did exactly what Charlotte Edwin told him to do. Which was, she realized, the only thing that had ever been missing. At 5:47 in the morning, as the first real light broke over the Blue Ridge, Charlotte went quietly down the hall and into the children's room. She stood for a moment between their beds in the thin gold light. Eli sleeping with his characteristic gravity, hands folded on the blanket like a small person with important business to attend to in his dreams. Rose sprawled with her characteristic abandon, rabbit tucked under one arm, mouth slightly open, every feature of her face a portrait of William. Charlotte crouched between the beds. Hey, she whispered. Hey, loves. Time to wake up. We're going on another adventure. Eli opened his eyes immediately. He was always like that, fully present the instant he was conscious. He looked at her. Then, with the particular perception of a child who has been paying very close attention to the adults around him, he looked toward the main room. Is Daddy here? He whispered. Charlotte felt it in her chest, the full complicated weight of the answer. Yes, she said. Daddy's here. Eli considered this for a moment. Then he sat up and reached for his shoes with the purposeful air of someone who had been waiting for this specific development and was ready to address it appropriately. Charlotte watched him and felt something loosen in her chest. Something that had been held at an impossible tension for 7 weeks, maybe longer, maybe for 3 years. Something that had never been named because naming it would have made it too real to survive. She reached out and brushed the hair from Rose's face. Rose stirred, blinked, focused on her mother. Mama, she said. The absolute simplicity of it. The complete sufficiency of it. Yeah, baby, Charlotte said. I'm right here. They moved at 6:12 in the morning. Fletcher arrived at the west entrance of the parking structure on Lexington with 4-pack security personnel. Quiet, disciplined, dressed in nothing that identified them as anything other than ordinary people with early starts. And Charlotte briefed them in 90 seconds flat, standing in the concrete shadow of the structure's second level with Eli on her hip and Rose holding the back of her jacket, because she had woken the children and there had been no time to arrange anything more orderly than this. Fletcher looked at her during the briefing with an expression she recognized from the handful of times she'd observed him at PAC meetings through the archive room window. The expression of a professional encountering another professional, recalibrating his assessment in real time. The East Side Watcher is stationed at the coffee shop overhang, she said. He rotates every 90 minutes. He was at the corner of the next block at 4:30, back at the overhang by 5:50. There's a second one I haven't visually confirmed, but whose pattern I've inferred from the gaps in what the first one can cover. He's almost certainly on the roof of the building opposite mine, or the fire escape on its north face. The blind spot is the alley running between the parking structure and the dry cleaners on Merrimon. It's not covered. I walked it twice. Fletcher nodded once. We go through the alley. We go through the alley, Charlotte confirmed. William was standing slightly behind Fletcher, and she could feel him watching her, and she was not looking at him because she could not afford the distraction of looking at him right now. Let's move, she said. They were 3 blocks from the parking structure, moving through the alley in a tight group, when Conrad Voss made his move. It was not the move Charlotte had expected. She had expected something through the tribunal, legal architecture, procedural pressure, the kind of attack that required response rather than reaction. She had understood that Voss was shifting from patience to action, but she had calculated the action as institutional. She had miscalculated. The 2 men who stepped out of the shadow at the far end of the alley were not lawyers. They were large, and they were still in the particular trained way of people who have decided exactly what they are about to do, and one of them was the man she had seen watching the bookshop, the one who had wanted her to see him, the message deliverer, and she understood now that the message had not been "I know where you are." The message had been "walk into the alley." They had moved her. They had anticipated the blind spot, because of course Voss had mapped this city as thoroughly as she had, because he had had 7 weeks and resources she hadn't accounted for. And they had used her own plan against her. For seconds of assessment. 2 hostiles ahead. Fletcher and his team behind her, but the alley was narrow enough that maneuvering was compromised. Children. Children were the variable that changed everything. Charlotte acted before she had finished thinking. She turned, dropped to one knee, and pressed both children firmly into Fletcher's arms. The movement so clean and decisive that Eli didn't even cry out, just grabbed Fletcher's collar with both hands and held on. Rose clutched her rabbit. "Go," she said to Fletcher. "Back the way we came. Don't stop." "Charlotte," William's voice sharp. "William." She stood up and looked at him over her shoulder. "Trust me. For once in either of our lives, trust me." She turned back to the men at the end of the alley. And she walked toward them. She had known about the secondary phone for 6 weeks. It had come to her in the 3rd week in Asheville, in the particular way that solutions came to her. Quietly, at the edges of something else she was thinking about, arriving fully formed. She had obtained it through Harriet, who had a nephew who dealt in telecommunications gray markets, and who had not asked what it was for, because Harriet had the wisdom not to ask things she understood instinctively were better not asked. The phone contained one thing. A recording 14 minutes long, captured through the open window of a Tampa hotel room 11 months ago, during the Midsummer Assembly. A recording of a conversation between Conrad Voss and a woman whose voice Charlotte had recognized immediately when she played it back, the voice being as familiar to her as her own. Her sister's voice. Vivian had been careful. She had been very careful for a very long time. But she had not been careful enough in Tampa. In the room 2 floors below Charlotte's, where Charlotte had gone to return a coat Vivian had left in the assembly hall, where she had stood in the corridor outside the door and listened for 40 seconds before understanding what she was hearing, and then had done the thing that Charlotte always did when she encountered information she didn't know what to do with yet. She had filed it away. She had obtained the recording, a long and complicated process involving a contact at the hotel and a device she would not describe in detail even to herself. And she had carried it with her since, the way you carry something you hope you never need to use. She needed to use it now. The 2 men from the alley had walked her. Not roughly, not with hands on her, because they were not stupid enough to touch the Alpha King's children's mother in a public space in a city where cameras existed. To a black SUV parked on a side street 2 blocks from the alley entrance. The implication of force was sufficient without its application. She had gone because going told her things that refusing would not. The man in the back seat of the SUV was not Conrad Voss. He was a representative, 50s, sharp-faced, wearing the kind of suit that said attorney in every language. He introduced himself as Harlan Price, counsel for the Northern Appalachian Pac, and he placed a manila folder on the seat between them and explained, in the measured tones of a man who enjoyed this particular genre of conversation, that the folder contained documentation supporting a formal claim through the Interpac Tribunal that Charlotte Edwin had unlawfully removed the Alpha King's children from Pac territory, that this constituted grounds for a supervised custody arrangement to be administered by the tribunal, and that his client, the Northern Appalachian Pac, acting as a good-faith third party, was prepared to serve as neutral custodians during the adjudication process. Charlotte listened to all of this without interrupting. When Harlan Price finished, he folded his hands over his folder and looked at her with the expression of a man who had delivered this particular kind of bad news many times and had learned to enjoy the silence that followed it. Charlotte reached into her jacket pocket and placed the secondary phone on the seat. "Before you proceed," she said, "I'd like you to listen to something." She pressed play. The recording was 14 minutes of Vivian's voice and Conrad Voss's voice in a Tampa hotel room 11 months ago. The first 3 minutes were careful and circling, the language of 2 people who have been communicating through layers of deniability for so long that directness feels foreign. By minute 4, the deniability had peeled away. Vivian described William's movements, his schedule, his emotional state, the children's routines, the layout of the cottage, the specific times Charlotte was alone on the estate. Voss described what he intended to do with the information. The custody challenge was mentioned explicitly, not as a legitimate concern but as a legal crowbar, a way to get Charlotte into tribunal proceedings where Voss's influence over 2 of the 7 arbitrators would give him control of the outcome. Control of the outcome meant control of the children. Control of the children meant control of William. Vivian asked, at minute 11, What happened to Charlotte if the plan succeeded? Voss said, "That depends on how cooperative she decides to be." Vivian was quiet for 3 seconds. Then she said, "She won't be cooperative." Voss said, "Then it won't go well for her." Vivian said nothing after that. The recording ended 30 seconds later. Charlotte pressed stop. Harlan Price was looking at the phone with an expression that had undergone a complete transformation from the one he'd been wearing 30 seconds ago. The folder sat between them, suddenly a great deal less powerful than it had been. "That recording," he said carefully, "may not be legally." "I'm not interested in what it is legally," Charlotte said. "I'm interested in what it does when I send it to the Interpac Tribunal's Oversight Board, the Southeastern Territory Elder Council, and the 3 Florida-based PAC attorneys who have been building a case against Voss's boundary violations for 4 years." She had done her research. 3 months in an archive room and a lifetime of paying attention had made her very good at research. "I'm also interested in what it does to your client's standing when it becomes clear that the claimed good-faith third party in this custody proceeding was running an active intelligence operation against the Alpha King using his mate's own sister as an asset." She picked up the phone, put it back in her pocket. "And I'm interested in what it does to your license, specifically when the tribunal learns that you filed a proceeding you had reason to know was based on manufactured pretext." Harlan Price's jaw was very still. "So here's what's going to happen," Charlotte said. "You're going to get out of this car. You're going to return to your client and tell him that the custody filing is being withdrawn. You're going to tell him that the surveillance operation on this city ends today. Every watcher, every asset, every piece of infrastructure he has built in Asheville over the past 7 weeks is gone by noon. And you're going to tell him," she paused, making sure she had Price's full attention. She did. "You're going to tell him that I have 3 copies of that recording in 3 separate locations, and that if anything happens to me, to my children, or to anyone connected to me, all 3 copies go public simultaneously. Not to the tribunal. To everyone." She opened the car door. "I'd recommend he believe me," she said. She got out. She walked back down the side street toward the alley, toward the parking structure, toward Fletcher and her children and William, and she did not look back. Behind her, the SUV sat without moving for a long moment. Then it drove away. Fletcher was waiting at the mouth of the alley with both children and an expression of profound, controlled alarm. Rose was eating a cracker that had appeared from somewhere in Fletcher's jacket. He was, Charlotte had always suspected, secretly the most prepared person at Blackthorn Keep. And Eli was standing at Fletcher's side with his arms crossed, watching the street with an expression of 4-year-old determination that was so precisely his father's face that Charlotte almost had to stop walking. She didn't stop. She crouched in front of Eli and looked at him. "You okay, bud? Where did you go?" he asked. Reproachful. Dignified. "I had to talk to some people." "Were they bad people?" "They were people who made bad choices," Charlotte said. "There's a difference." Eli considered this with the gravity that deserved. Then he nodded, apparently satisfied with the philosophical distinction, and uncrossed his arms. William was standing 10 feet behind Fletcher. Charlotte stood up and looked at him. He had been watching her since she came around the corner. She knew that without checking. She knew the quality of his attention the way you know the weather. It had its own particular pressure, its own temperature. She walked to him. She stopped 2 feet away and looked up at him in the early morning light. The mountains gold-edged now, the sky opening up above the city into something clear and enormous after what felt like endless gray. "The recording," he said. It wasn't a question. He had heard enough. 11 months ago, she said. "Tampa. I didn't know what to do with it. So I kept it." "You kept it," he repeated. Something moved across his face. "I keep things," she said. "It's a habit. I keep things and I wait until I know what they're for." He looked at her for a long moment. The anguish was still there, but it had company now, something that looked, around the edges, like the beginning of relief. Or wonder. Or both, which were not always different things. "Charlotte," he said. "Don't," she said. "Not here. Not in front of Fletcher, who is going to pretend he isn't listening, but will remember every word of this for the rest of his life and potentially write it down." Fletcher, 10 feet away, said absolutely not, in a tone that confirmed he was listening to every word. Despite everything, Despite the alley and the SUV and Harlan Price and Vivian and the whole impossible weight of the past 7 weeks and the past 3 years, Charlotte felt the corner of her mouth move. It was a small movement. It was involuntary. She didn't try to stop it. William saw it. She watched him see it, watched something happen in his face at the sight of it. Something that broke and healed simultaneously, which she hadn't known a face could do until she was watching his do it. "When we're not in front of Fletcher," he said carefully, "will you let me say what I need to say?" "That depends," Charlotte said, "on whether it's worth hearing." "It is," he said. "It won't fix everything. I'm not asking you to let it fix everything. I'm asking for the chance to say it." She looked at him for a long moment. At this man who had loved her badly and protected her clumsily and made the wrong choice for reasons she could now at least understand, even if she could not yet forgive them. At this man who had carried a crayon drawing folded in his inside pocket for 7 weeks and had come himself, alone before dawn, to a city he'd never been to stand in her doorway with the armor finally off. "Fine," she said. "You can say it." He exhaled. It was, she thought, the first real breath she'd heard him take. The Interpac Tribunal received the recording 48 hours later. It was delivered by a Southeastern Territory PAC attorney named Roland Fitch, who had been working the Voss boundary case for 4 years and who, upon being handed a USB drive by Fletcher Gaines with a brief summary of its contents, had sat very still for approximately 30 seconds and then said with considerable restraint, "Well, that changes things rather significantly." It changed things significantly. The custody filing was withdrawn within 6 hours of the recording's submission. Harlan Price's name disappearing from the tribunal record with the particular speed of a man distancing himself from a sinking structure. The Oversight Board opened a formal investigation into Conrad Voss's conduct within 48 hours. 2 of the 7 arbitrators he had claimed influence over submitted voluntary recusals, which was the institutional equivalent of a confession. The 3rd didn't submit one. Roland Fitch handled that separately, with the recording and a law firm's letterhead, and it took 4 days rather than 2, but it was handled. Conrad Voss did not make another move against Charlotte or the children. Whether this was because of the recording, or because William Richard made a single phone call to him in which words were exchanged that Fletcher declined to describe afterward beyond saying, "It was a short call," Charlotte couldn't be certain. She suspected it was both. She was fine with both. Vivian called on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks later. Charlotte was in the bookshop, reorganizing the new arrivals table, and her personal phone buzzed with a number she recognized. She looked at it for a moment. Then she set down the book she was holding, walked to the back of the shop, and answered. "Charlotte," Vivian's voice. The familiar cadence. The register that Charlotte had trusted instinctively for 31 years. "Don't," Charlotte said. Silence. "I'm not going to do this on the phone," Charlotte said. "I'm not going to do it yet. I'm not ready to do it yet, and I'm not going to do it before I'm ready, and right now I need you to understand one thing." She kept her voice very level. "The children are not a tool. They are not a piece in anyone's strategy. They are children. Whatever you thought you were doing, whatever Voss told you that made it seem like a reasonable thing to do to your own sister and her children, I need you to sit with the fact that you chose that. You chose it, and I will talk to you when I'm ready and not before." She ended the call. She stood in the back of the bookshop for a moment. She had cried, in the privacy of the apartment, on the night William told her about Vivian. She had cried in the specific way of someone whose grief has 2 components: the loss itself, and the loss of the version of reality where the loss wasn't possible. Both kinds for a long time. And she had given herself that because she had learned in the 3 years of being invisible at Blackthorn Keep that refusing to feel things did not remove them. It only deferred them with interest. She had felt it. She had put it where it needed to go. And now she walked back to the new arrivals table and picked up the book she'd set down and found her place. There was an evening, 6 weeks after the alley, after the recording, after the tribunal filing, after the phone call with Vivian, after many conversations with William that happened gradually and honestly, and without resolution arriving all at once, because that was not how resolution worked in real life. There was an evening when the 4 of them were in the apartment on Lexington Avenue. William had come up for the weekend. He did that now, Came up on Friday evenings in the black truck with Florida plates, knocked 3 times with the deliberate spacing she recognized, and stayed through Sunday. It was not a solution. It was a beginning, which was different. Charlotte was learning to tell the difference. Eli had decided on this particular evening that the appropriate activity was a game of his own invention that involved couch cushions arranged in a specific pattern on the floor that only made sense to him, and that required everyone's participation, and that had rules he explained at length and then changed without warning. Rose participated by sitting in the middle of the cushion arrangement and periodically rearranging things according to her own aesthetic preferences, which conflicted dramatically with Eli's vision, but which she executed with such serene confidence that Eli kept accommodating them. William was sitting on the floor with his long legs folded, moving cushions when directed to, losing track of the rules, being corrected by a 4-year-old with a patience that Charlotte found both hilarious and profoundly moving. She was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, watching. William looked up from the cushion arrangement and found her eyes across the room. He held her gaze. No armor. No management. Just him, sitting on the floor of her apartment in the Blue Ridge Mountains with their children climbing on him, looking at her the way he had looked at her since Tampa, like she was the thing in the room that everything else oriented around. She looked back at him. She thought about the rain over Everglades Ridge. She thought about the torches burning despite the downpour. She thought about walking into the dark with a child's hand in each of hers, and the Gulf of Mexico at 40,000 feet, and the motel in Pensacola, and Harriet handing her tea in a bookshop aisle, and the alley, and the SUV, and the 14-minute recording, and the way William's voice had cracked on the word alive, and Rose's crayon drawing on the table between them, and Eli asking, "In the dark, is Daddy here?" She thought about all the ways a thing could be broken and still, in some altered form, be real. She thought about the fact that she had not arrived at happiness. She might not arrive at it for a long time. She was somewhere more complicated and more honest than happiness. Somewhere that had no clean name, that required daily decisions rather than a single redemptive moment, that looked from the outside like a woman sitting at a kitchen table with a cup of tea watching her children play. That was fine. The thing she had learned, in 7 weeks of running and 3 years of being invisible and a lifetime of tucking feelings into the back of her throat, was this. The bravest thing was not the running. The running was just motion. The bravest thing was deciding what to go back for, and going back for it with your eyes open, knowing the full cost, choosing it anyway. She had chosen it anyway. She took a sip of her tea. Across the room, Eli directed William to move a cushion 3 inches to the left with the authority of someone who would, someday, be extraordinary at something. William moved it. Then Eli changed his mind and moved it back. William moved it back without complaint. Rose looked at Charlotte across the room and held up her rabbit. Charlotte raised her teacup. Rose giggled. It was the particular giggle that sounded like water over stones, like something that had always existed and would always exist, like the most fundamental sound in the world. Outside the window, the Blue Ridge was gold in the last of the evening light. Charlotte set down her cup. She stood up. She walked across the room and sat down on the floor, inside the cushion arrangement, next to William. Eli immediately began explaining a rule revision that affected her participation. Rose climbed onto her lap with the rabbit and settled there with complete proprietary confidence. William said nothing. He didn't have to. He reached out, very quietly, and covered her hand with his. She let him. Outside, the mountains held the last of the light as long as they could, and then the dark came, the way it always does. Not as an ending, but as the pause between one day and the next, the held breath before morning. Charlotte Edwin had disappeared. And then she had decided to come back. Not to what it was. To what it could be. That, in the end, was the bravest kind of return. And that's where we leave them, not with a perfect resolution, but with a real one. Charlotte didn't forgive easily. She didn't forget. She chose deliberately, with full knowledge of the cost, and she chose herself first, which is the only way to choose anything that lasts. So here's the question I want you to sit with. Was it enough? Was William's truth, the protection, the wrong choice made for the right reason, enough to earn a second chance? Or would you have walked away for good? Drop your answer in the comments. Because the most interesting thing about Charlotte Edwin isn't what she survived. It's what she decided to do with the survival. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. The end. Charlotte ran. She survived. She chose. And if her story moved something in you, hit that subscribe button, because there are more worlds like this one waiting for you on this channel. Drop a comment telling me what you would have done in that rain. Like this video if Charlotte earned it. And tap the video on your screen right now, because the next werewolf story is darker, wilder, and nobody walks away the same.